All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is Mac McClelland. Mac is a journalist and human rights reporter for Mother Jones Magazine, which you can find at motherjones.com. You can also find her on Twitter at Mac McClelland. Mac, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so Mac, you currently have a phenomenal piece in the latest issue of Mother Jones where you write about how when veterans return from war, the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, not only horrifically affects them, but also actually spreads to their families. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Sure. Well, logically, I mean, if anyone had ever even just stopped to think about it without all the anecdotes that we've had since the World Wars, really, and all the research that's come in since World War II. But even if you just stop to think about it, if you live with a person who's severely traumatized and so has flashbacks, which are totally unpredictable, mood swings that can be totally unpredictable, you could wake your husband up, for example, from a nightmare, and you don't know if it's going to be a time when he wakes up swinging or not. You know, if you just think about the impact it would have on you, to not really know what the emotional state of a person was going to be on any given day, of course it affects people's families. And, a lot of veterans also have children. And of course, not all veterans get PTSD, and not all PTSD sufferers have, super severe symptoms. But those who do, if you have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old in the house, and, they are woken up in the middle of the night with one of their parents just like screaming or, not making any sense sometimes, or they can have violent outbursts even. Of course, that's a thing that impacts a whole family who's living under the same roof.
Yeah, no. In the article, you spend a good deal of time and really document this couple and their daughter, Caleb and Brannon. Tell us about the couple.
Caleb and Brannon she's my age, so she's 32, and he's just a couple years older. And they are from Alabama. They're like teenage sweethearts. So they've been married for a long time already, even though they're pretty young. And They got married before 9/11. After 9/11, Caleb decided to enlist, and he joined the infantry. He did 2 tours in Iraq. After the first tour, both of them say that he was pretty much okay. Things were pretty normal at the house. He was a little bit edgy and a little bit distant, but just the same sort of adjustment disorder anyone would have after they'd been in another country, much less another country at war for a really long time. But then after the second tour, he also suffered traumatic brain injury. So he was in a bunch of explosions. He had multiple concussions and concussions upon concussions, and really bad PTSD. A lot of terrible things happened, to him.
Actually, but let's move back real quick to the traumatic brain injury, because you write about this that I think is actually really another just horrific way we treat soldiers. He was actually, had explosions go off near him a lot of times, but he actually was not diagnosed with the traumatic brain injury until he actually made it back to the States, correct?
Right. Yeah, well, now they have rules that have actually only been in place for a couple years, where if you are in a serious explosion and you get thrown and you see stars or lose consciousness, you have to rest for a little bit before you go back out. But that wasn't true when Caleb was in theater. So, and
that was 2010 that those rules got changed.
Right.
Is what you're saying. So this is not. This is he was knocked unconscious. And when an explosion happened, he was thrown through a gate and knocked unconscious. And yet he still continued to go out and on patrol that very day without actually going and seeking medical attention after being literally knocked out.
Yeah. Which was totally common at that time.
Yeah.
So, he has the same problem that a lot of other soldiers have, and so he has traumatic brain injury like tens of thousands of other guys, and it's to have traumatic brain injury and PTSD at the same time is sort of extra complicated because you're dealing with trying to adjust to new a new brain, like one that you are not familiar with. He, for example, he was an engineering major at Auburn University, high scoring before he left, and he can't do basic math now. So in addition to dealing with, the fact that he was around a lot of killing and a lot of warfare and, all the other sorts of things that often lead to PTSD, he also has to deal with kind of a whole new kind of life, and adjusting to the both at the same time obviously makes both even harder to treat. So.
Yeah. So what are the symptoms? I mean, because I think some people kind of have some idea, and we've talked a little bit about it here. But like, what does Brannon on a day-to-day have to deal with? Because it's. Because you really do in the article really describe what actually, I mean, obviously no one can know what PTSD is unless they have it, and hopefully no one listening will have it ever, and if people are listening have been in a situation where they have it, but kind of go through what they describe the symptoms that Caleb actually has when on a day-to-day basis due to the PTSD.
Sure. Well, I mean, it depends on the person, of course, but in Caleb's particular case, they have to, you have flashbacks and nightmares sometimes, and then sometimes you don't, but, you have PTSD all the time, and so you never know what the triggers are going to be. So even if you're not actively in the middle of an episode, you could become in the middle of an episode in a matter of seconds. So their house is kept very quiet. There's it's dark. All the shades are drawn. There's no TV. They have Netflix on in the TV so that their daughter can watch children's movies and cartoons and things, but they can't have access. It's not hooked up to actual cable because they can't have news on ever. So it's sort of dark and quiet to keep the amount of triggers and stressors down, and it's just sort of tense. You just have this feeling of people, not just Brandon, but Caleb, because, even if you have PTSD, you don't know what's going to be the thing that sets you off. And so everybody is a little bit tense, just when things are okay, sort of waiting for when things will not be okay. And he sleeps a lot, the way that that's people with traumatic brain injury are often very tired. They get really tired really fast. And the way that the VA is treating PTSD is with these massive pharmaceutical cocktails. And so Caleb's on 11 pills a day or something. And so you can imagine he sleeps a lot between all those things. And, you could be in their dark and quiet house, and then he could be napping, and all of a sudden, somebody starts screaming, which it sounds even louder, compared to the quiet that they try to keep in the house. And, Brandon tries to wake him up, and he doesn't know who she is. He doesn't recognize her. He doesn't understand where he is. He starts screaming at her. They don't have any problems with drug abuse or violence, which is very fortunate for them, because a lot of
it's something that's very, very common with PTSD,
well, sure.
that people medicate themselves to try to just alleviate the pain that they're in.
Yeah, of course. I mean, you can imagine the level of desperation you could get to after suffering these kinds of symptoms for years and years and years. A lot of people do self-medicate. Luckily, they're not dealing with that, but just the tension and the uncertainty and the mood swings and everything is, I mean, it's a 24-hour-a-day condition, and it's 24-hour-a-day characteristics in that house that everyone has to sort of cope with it all the time, not just when he's in the middle of super serious attacks.
I'm talking to Mac McClelland, a journalist for Mother Jones magazine, motherjones.com. So let's talk. So that's Caleb, the one half of the couple, and you're describing what he's going through. But then the main thrust of your article is what Caleb's wife and daughter, his wife Brannon, and their daughter have to deal with, and how they're actually taking on characteristics of PTSD themselves. So talk a little about the two of them.
Yeah, well, secondary trauma is, very well, even though people in general society, don't really talk about it, it's extremely well documented. It has been documented for a variety of causes. I mean, it wouldn't be combat veterans are not the only people who, end up with secondary PTSD in their houses. People who have been traumatized in a variety of ways, having been mugged or assaulted or domestic violence, all sorts of things. But in the case of war in particular, they've done lots of studies for decades about the effect that having a traumatized person in your house can have on the other family members. And basically, being around a really traumatized person, so I just mentioned there can be a lot of yelling, there can be violent outbursts, and you never know. It's not consistent, which makes it sort of even worse because you have to be on edge all the time, just kind of waiting and being ready to cope or to deal with whatever kind of crisis is going to come up. And so that can sort of become the trauma of your spouse's or your child's own post-traumatic stress. So you can be traumatized just by being around a person who's severely traumatized, which, again, like I said, of course, it impacts everyone. Like if you think about being married to a person who's struggling with a severe emotional disorder, of course it impacts you. So they've been doing studies on this for decades. And people in, the children of Vietnam veterans with PTSD, if you ever met even one, they could tell you about it. So anecdotally, you've had these stories coming in addition to the statistics and everything. But the VA has just never dealt with it and has decided sort of not to deal with it. In the article, I interview a bunch of the practitioners and the people who are in charge of deciding what kind of treatment people get and what kind of treatment is best. They don't extend benefits in most circumstances to any spouses or children of veterans. And so, but they know, if you ask them about secondary trauma, they're like, oh yeah, sure, that. No, we don't really have treatment for that. They're already so bogged down and spending so much money, on just treating the veterans that it makes sense that they haven't gotten it together and don't have the extra billions of dollars to treat spouses and children as well. But, that's the sort of thing that you really need to factor in when you're calculating what a war is going to cost. So the VA was recommending to me that people could, if you were a spouse or a child, you could try to find a psychiatrist who would treat you for free. Try to find someone
that's easy, right? Just go down to the free, go to see like Lucy with Charlie Brown and pay a nickel. The psychiatrist is in or something like that, right?
Yeah, they do have some. There are some groups. There's one called Give an Hour. There are some groups of psychologists, around the country that do pro bono work for veterans and veterans' family because. Or
we'll do something on a sliding scale and stuff like that. Right. But just hey, go find a free psychiatrist is sort of a cop out in in every way you can look about it.
It's a total cop out. Well, plus, the fact that they're not talking about it and the VA isn't talking about it, isn't dealing with it, means that a lot of people aren't educated enough to know. That it might be good to get a child psychologist, for example, involved in you need a lot of coping skills to be a 5 or 6 year old who lives in a house with a lot of trauma in it. And, culturally, we don't have a lot of coping skills knowledge. Certainly not something I learned or was ever taught. So